As we begin part two of the lesson on the reasons for American prosperity in the 1920s, we start focusing on new business methods. As you're aware, and this sort of started to happen before the 1920s, the Americans became very technologically innovative. In America, it was a hotbed of design, and that had a lot of things to do with access to patents, access to capital markets, ability to raise funds, unlimited access to a massive and growing domestic market, spurred on invention to a great degree, even to some degree, the lack of government regulation. Now, the 1920s was notable for the growth of massive corporations. And you might be saying, well, there are many massive corporations. And what we're talking about here is the proliferation of massive corporations in most sectors of the economy. The 1920s is known for, above all, the introduction of scientific methods of management and advertising. Okay, these are the utilization of knowledge gained over the last 40 years, taught and delivered and codified into ways people should go about things and taught in universities to a new group of business management students who come out to be the managers of the corporations. Couple that with a new field, the realization that people and the market could be obtained best with dynamic advertising, making people want to buy your product. Was one of the major reasons beyond just I need what you make, people start consuming at ever greater proportions. So when you have increased consumption and a more efficient run businesses, profits increase through the roof. By 1929, you have 200 corporations possessing 20% of the nation's wealth. It's absolutely massive. Uh, 1,200 large-scale business mergers happened in the 1920s. And what you get is, beyond any shadow of a doubt, huge corporations dominating the majority of the sectors in the American business world. Huge corporations, let's get into those for a sec, okay? A huge corporation, such as, let's take a really good example of something that emerges into 20. The United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company comes to dominate an industry in various ways. Number one, by controlling, let's just say, something that's very common, bananas. Okay, by controlling the import and export and growth of bananas, both in the United States and the importation of them on huge plantations that they own abroad, they could fix prices. So, in other words, when you go to buy a banana, and you probably pretty used to this today. You can buy it in Tesco's, you can buy it in Sainsbury's, you can buy it in any grocery store or any place. Banana costs what a banana costs. And that has a large part to do with the fact that one company basically owns the world's production of bananas. And that means that that price is fixed. That price of banana is reflective of both a margin a company wants to get off that banana and the cost of actually producing that banana and paying the employees to do it. This has the effect of reducing competition because if somebody wants to come in and say, hey, I've got a whole new crop of bananas, for instance, they could undercut their bananas, which means that the new guy who is producing cannot afford to compete in that industry. And all of this means that the large corporations begin to maximize their profits in new and unheard of ways. Let's look at US Steel, a company we've talked about before. Basically, this company, after being purchased by JP Morgan, comes to dominate almost the entire United States steel industry. Not only are they regulating prices, they're regulating output. So if they find that demand is falling for steel, they can reduce how much they produce. It's something known as cartelization. And anyways, make a long story short, U.S. Steel can always ensure, no matter what, that their profit remains extremely high. Many of the companies in U.S. Steel across the board had different names, but they were effectively run by holding companies, and something we've talked about before, where many of the board members were the same for multiple companies. Though supposedly competing against each other, they're effectively serving the same master. And this allows them to fix output and prices while having the appearance of being multiple different companies. And of course, government, in light of this, of course, as it has always been, government acts against the interests of small business. Many people also see these businessmen as heroes, which also makes the boom possible. There becomes something attached to the American dream, that these people who become these captains of industry are worshipped in the United States. Okay, so we talk about the the captains of industry, and sometimes they were oftentimes referred to robber barons, but people didn't see them that way. The people who go and make it rich and create these huge companies are seen as heroes. and worshipped in the same way sometimes we would worship a sports figure. So the United States mentality is very much about the worship of excessive corporate gain. I alluded to the fact that management science comes in. Now, what they start doing at universities in the early part of the 20th century is studying how to make business more efficient. With the increased size of businesses and these multi-tiered corporations, it became incredibly necessary to develop systems that never existed before in order to manage this efficiently. And what we see is the management universities come up with the idea of teaching people to specialize in different areas. And we see that in business today. You have a large corporation, you may be someone in charge of finance, but that corporation could equally have someone whose sole job is to focus and think about the marketing of that company and how their advertisements, for instance, go out to the world. Other people would be concerned with design, making sure that the corporate appearance of the company, both in its buildings and its advertisements and the stuff it puts out there, is sleek and attractive, and it represents whatever the company's image it wants to be. And this was unheard of previously. Effectively, a company was run by one guy, and everybody went out and worked hard and tried to make it work. The sort of jack of all trades approach to this. And of course, when business schools grow to meet the demand of this, you get a huge portion of a new class of managers really being launched into the middle class coming out of business schools. By 1928, you have 89 business schools in the United States, churning out about 67,000 students a year with graduate degrees in management science. Okay, and the fact that this was actually increasingly becoming popular and will maintain an increasingly popularity actually to this day. Also, it reflects the fact that, the American dream now of coming and starting your own thing and making your own thing has effectively been undermined. Now the American dream is to become a leader in a company that's already established. In some cases, management science applied to industry removes all initiative from the labor force. What we see in the 1920s is the mechanization of labor and the dehumanization of labor to the nth degree. And what do I mean by that? Well, it used to be that, let's just say you went to a car factory. Let's just say you were building the automobile in the time before Henry Ford really comes along with his assembly line. Now, you would be responsible for all things to do with the engine, the tuning of that engine, the insertion of that engine, the connection of that engine. What happens with labor is they find it's cheaper and more efficient, and you can make more of things if you are now in charge of turning that one screw as that engine comes down the line. And the person next to you inserts that pipe, and then the next person drops that engine in the car. And as it goes down the line, what each person does is the same repetitive task over and over and over. And this removes not only initiative, but it makes industry incredibly mind-numbing and almost dehumanizing. The Charlie Chaplin movie, Modern Times, mimics the dehumanizing effect of labor. And when you're looking at this, I've put the YouTube link to that movie in there, and you just sort of get an idea. I mean, it's obviously satire, but it's satire with a purpose. It's meant to indicate that basically the way we do things is mind-numbingly boring, and it's destroying the individual. But anyhow, it makes a lot of money, so they did it, and that is the way things work in large part then, and to an extent right now. The other big thing that comes out of this is advertisement. Okay, the new mass media, radio being the big one of that, and also the birth of a widely accessible cinema industry. In fact, cinema in the 1920s will overtake theater in attendance. This creates really probably the modern cult of celebrity. What we see now is people with accessible media looking at and getting engaged with the lives of celebrities and gossip, commercials, advertising. Now, in the United States, one station in 1920 becomes 618 by 1929. And the vast majority of these, like every other branch of industry, are controlled by two massive conglomerates. There's a National Broadcasting Corporation, NBC, and there's CBS. what they do to make money is they charge advertisers money to sponsor the programs that they pay for and put on. The more people who listen, the more money they can charge in advertising, and it's still that way to the today. What we see in the 1920s too is instead of just having what they put, we get programs that cater to mass appeal. On radio, there are radio dramas, very similar to a TV, but only played out on radio, and people have to use their imagination based on what they hear. Seems probably foreign to you, but this was high entertainment in the 1920s. Um, you get programs that cater to various sectors of society. You get sport broadcast on radio for the first time, baseball being the big sport in America. The World Series and baseball games throughout the season, day to day, are broadcast across the nation. You get with that also the birth of cult sports heroes. By by 1929, most programs in many ways are linked to a product that supports them. So if you, for instance, are a fan of the show Little Orphan Annie, a famous American show from the 1920s and 30s. It was sponsored by a company named Ovaltine, and Ovaltine is an American company that still exists. I believe it's owned by Nestle right now. It's basically a chocolate milk powder drink that you sort of you can either buy pre-packaged a pre-shaken chocolate milk drink for children or in powder form. Anyways, that's Ovaltine, and it was sponsored Little Orphan Annie, just as one example. But what you see is the link between mass media and advertising that still exists today. You know when you watch a movie that if they're always drinking cans of Coke, Coke paid a lot of money for that, and this is sort of developed, or the birth of this advertising industry comes in the 1920s, and it has a real purpose. There is a constant need to create demand. One of the key things you need to remember about the 1920s is one of the big problems that will lead to the crash of the late 1920s and 1930s is the fact that U.S. industry is growing, yes, but they're also overproducing. They're producing way more than people can afford and way more than they can need. And with a sort of access to foreign markets closed off due to the high tariffs, they can't really get rid of their surplus. So there's a need to make high level advertising that gets the average American to go into debt and buy more and more and more and more and more. With most products too being virtually the same. Let's take the car, for instance, okay? If you look at pictures of the car in the 1920s, you'll see parking lots of thousands of cars that look exactly the same. What you need to do with advertising is differentiate why a General Motors built car is different than a Ford built car, or a Chrysler car is different than a Ford built car, even though on balance, unlike today, cars are relatively the same. Now, for instance, if you look at cars, you see, the basic features. They all have steering wheel and four wheels, and they go forward and backwards, and they turn right and left. But the bottom line, apart from that, things are quite different. The interior, the sport, the capability, the bells and whistles you have inside. In the 1920s, we don't have heated seats, so we're not talking about that type of stuff, but we're talking about like different aspects, okay? Creating lifestyle around your car, okay? And the success of your advertising campaign in many ways becomes one of the biggest factors between profit and loss. And the best example of that is Ford. Ford almost goes belly up in the 1920s because they don't innovate and they don't advertise. They rest on their laurels. They were the first guy in the game, and as a sense, they had dominated the market. But their market share starts to get eaten away by General Motors and Chrysler in the middle to late 1920s. And by the middle, let's say, I think it's 1926, 1927. Don't quote me on that because we'll come back to it later on. The numbers slip my mind. Ford falls out of the marketplace, and anyways, making you realize how important this is. Ford actually has to stop production for a year. Well, they change all of their factories around. So not only can they mass produce, okay, they can develop a car that has the things that people want. They can develop a new style, which is attractive and can be advertised around it. Ford saves itself, but it comes close to going belly up in the 1920s because it doesn't innovate and it doesn't certainly advertise, and it's getting eaten alive by General Motors and Chrysler. The fourth reason is easy credit, and we've talked about this before, but this becomes a massive thing in the 1920s. The massive consumerism driven by the advertising age is fueled by the fact that people are borrowing money at a ridiculous rate. For instance, in 1929, $7 billion worth of goods were sold on credit. 75% of all cars bought were bought on some sort of payment plan. It's probably true of today, if not greater. Oh, Americans don't become afraid of debt. In fact, they get quite comfortable with it. Half of the household appliances they buy, right down to the simple things, are bought on some sort of payment plan. And this enables people to buy goods they otherwise couldn't afford. But it leads to problems, of course, if the borrowers take on too much debt. And with easy credit, well, literally money being thrown at people, people don't really realize the long-term ramifications of carrying too much debt. It's assumed basically by banks and creditors that, well, because people are doing well and America is doing well, everyone's credit must be good. But it wasn't true. And what you have is the most indebted population in the world at the time of the banking crisis owing all of their money at once. And that becomes a major, major issue. Okay, so banks and loan companies are lending out too much money. And the last point we're going to cover is the fact that the influence on America of foreign economies is a big reason for the boom. Now, uh, the idea of globalization, where we exist in a world where the things we buy come from all areas, is a relatively new concept in the 1920s. In fact, it's a concept that most people aren't familiar with. Maybe save if you were working within the context of the British Empire, where the empire provided various things from all around the world, from its different entrepôts and outposts and so forth. However, in most other economies, the things you had in your house were the things you produced. You were proud to, buy American. But at this point, we have the foreign company, American industry investing greatly in the world. And this really sets America up more than anything else to become a massive global player. But what we see is that the government is encouraging American companies to develop their own interests. It's actually a way of getting around the tariffs, because if you're producing, let's say, um, fruit in Venezuela, and Venezuela has a tariff against American food, because you are a company with a base in Venezuela, you don't have to pay that tariff. Anyhow, but nevertheless, the American companies, with their massive financial advantage, take on new and emerging companies and set up bases to do the things that those countries need. So, in essence, when Canada, for instance, is producing oil or electricity, the profits of that is going directly to the United States, because it is, of course, American companies like General Electric that sets up the electrical grid in Canada. Another good example would be Firestone Tires. Firestone Tires owns most of Liberia. In fact, to this day, if you go to Liberia, the huge rubber plantations that provide the rubber for the tires on American cars, and Firestone is like Michelin, it's a massive American car company, are still owned by Firestone. I had mentioned previously the United Fruit Company. They made more money in Costa Rica than the government, and they have massive, massive plantations everywhere. In fact, the United Fruit Company is largely responsible for the deforestation of the Amazon right now. Not that I'm being critical of it, but this is just a point to say that this still continues. And I'm also being critical of it, let's be honest. Anyways, the US investment saw the development of public health and schools in developing countries. And why did people allow the United States to come and dominate their industries? Because part of it was a sort of an economic imperialism. The United States, having businesses in those areas, allowed those countries and required those countries to develop the health programs and the schools programs so that the American employees over there would have access to, let's just say, first world quality healthcare. But this allowed these companies, and it provided these countries with enough money to do that, which also provided it for their citizens. So there was a little bit of a cost benefit. However, this will leave them deeply indebted, both politically and financially, to the United States. A couple more points. The United States will export vast amounts of manufactured goods. I had mentioned that the tariff was high, but because they dominate markets, okay, Canada is probably the best example. Um, they are able to, with the fact that they're producing the things that people want, come to dominate foreign markets as well. There were a few nascent car industries developed in Canada, but when Ford and General Motors and Chrysler enter the market in a big way, even with the tariffs, which make their cars a little bit more expensive, the fact that they're mass producing them means that they can still undercut local products. And basically, if you go to Canada today, well, basically 100% of the cars are foreign owned. There's no Canadian car industry. It's completely destroyed. The United States also developed commercial ties with Soviet Russia. Very interestingly, in the time of Stalin and his 5-year plans, 25% of all the foreign investment was American. They invest heavily in Germany at this particular point, something we'll talk about a little bit later on. 33% of all Ford tractors, for instance, go to the Soviet Union for use in their projects of collectivization. By the 1930s, the United States it will invest $17 billion overseas. The global reliance in many ways on US investment is also quite dangerous. We'll talk about this. But effectively, what this means is that as other countries become, especially smaller ones, enormously dependent on US investment, when the United States hits hard times in 1929 and into the 1930s, these countries suffer dramatically because they had been so used to the power of American money being propping up their economies. The best example, of course, is Germany, but we'll talk about that, like I said, in other lessons. Um, so, what's the conclusion here? On the surface, if you were living in the 1920s America, whether you really enjoyed it or not, most people accepted that this was a time of great prosperity. But in reality, you didn't have to scratch very far below the surface. And if I'm honest, people weren't being honest with themselves. Um, Even though there was almost full employment, low inflation, tariffs protected the government market, this was a time of great optimism. There are huge issues scratching below the surface. Get off the main roads and head into rural America, and you'll be shocked at the disparity in income. The other thing I need to point out too is when we talk about all of this big industry, you need to remember that still the majority of this industry is located in the Midwest and the Northeast. So I'm talking about that sort of northern corridor known as the Rust Belt that stretches from Chicago along the bottom of the Great Lakes into the northeastern United States as far down as, say, Philadelphia. And outside of that, with the exception of the West, California, and so forth, you have a very different America. And we're going to get into over the next couple lessons the very real problems with this system that maybe if they didn't manifest themselves during the boom days in the middle of the 1920s, they are just waiting to appear. Once the ship hits rocky waters, they're going to find that they're in the middle of a very, very, very big storm indeed.